are a couple of things that folks should be thinking about. In the presentation, as I was pulling the materials together, I looked into examples of, cost shifting in healthcare. So, we do have studies and data on behaviors of providers, hospitals, pharmaceutical manufacturers when there's opportunities to cost shift. So what do previous experiences tell us about what may or may not be likely to happen? What are some of the potential impacts of the Part D redesign on beneficiaries as well? Like, what are we thinking that the Part D benefit is going to look like now that starting in a couple of years, plans are going to have a much larger financial liability than they historically have had? And so how might that change their approach to even designing the benefit available to beneficiaries? And what are some things, if you're a manufacturer, you might be looking out for? And then, I do think it's kind of interesting. Things are still sort of happening as we're talking. I was just making some notes about some slides to add. We do have the president's budget is expected tomorrow. He's already indicated that there's going to be a couple of proposals in there about the negotiating authority and some additional Medicare related proposals. So we'll have the opportunity to look at that. We also have, last week, the announcement from Eli Lilly about some changes that they're planning to make on pricing for all of their customers for insulin. And, I think that there were multiple reasons why that happened. But, I do think one of the reasons is the $35 insulin copay cap in Medicare Part D, as that was part of the IRA, is supremely popular, and trying to expand, I think there was sort of a push among the consumers, the patient advocacy groups, to get that expanded. And so I think it will also be interesting, another thing I'm looking out for, I'm going to be interested to see, is how the negotiated prices, which will be publicly available, and I'm sure, at least for this first round, since the prices will be announced about a month or two before the presidential election, I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot about what those prices end up being. So one thing that I'm going to be looking for is for the commercial patients, which, as everyone knows, that's the majority of Americans. Do those prices, does having access to that pricing information, does that resonate with them? So if I also take one of the drugs that's now going to be negotiated, and I now know what the Medicare negotiated price is, and I go to the pharmacy to fill that drug, my prescription, it's unlikely that I'm going to have access to that same price. Is that something where are we going to start hearing pressure from patients, from employers, to maybe push some of those prices down in other sectors, absent government intervention? So those are all other things that I'm planning to talk about. But those are just sort of some additional pieces that I'm looking for. Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. And I don't know. I mean, of course, the Democrats still have control of the Senate, so maybe they could get something through the House. Speaker McCarthy has a very narrow majority, so that would be tough. And they have no veto proof. I don't think there's anything it would easily be vetoed by a President Biden. Now, where we could see some change is on the administrative side. If we have a change in presidential administrations in 2025 as a result of the 2024 elections, there is some flexibility in, we don't know how aggressive HHS is planning to be when they go to negotiate prices. We know that the IRA sets a maximum fair price. So one approach could simply be to negotiate to the maximum fair price. Or they could try to get more aggressive and try to negotiate a price below the maximum fair price and see if they're successful at that. That is something that an administration, absent any intervention from Congress, is going to be able to do. So I could see a situation where, for example, if the Biden administration does take a more aggressive approach and is able to secure prices, negotiated prices that are below that maximum fair price, then, a Republican administration could, one sort of easy way that they could step back a little bit would be to just simply go in and set the prices at the maximum fair price. That would be, could be seen as like a little more industry friendly. You could just potentially have a situation where they just don't do the negotiations. You would then, I imagine, a patient advocacy organization would file a lawsuit, but because of the delays you have to have, in order to file a lawsuit, you have to have somebody that has standing. So you would have to wait until prices that weren't negotiated, or I believe the way that it would work is that you would have to wait, I would think, until the prices that were going to be negotiated but weren't would have gone into effect. Then you would, in theory, have Medicare beneficiaries that would have standing. They could argue that they have been injured by, HHS not following the law, and they could sue. But that would be a couple of years down the road. I think that's a pretty aggressive tactic. I don't think that's something that is reasonable, but it would be a potential, that's an option on the table. And I just think the issue of drug negotiation is so politically popular, even among independents and Republicans. I think it would be really, really tough for the Republicans to do something to repeal it entirely. I find it really hard to believe that they would try to repeal a $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket costs for Medicare beneficiaries. These are just things that people like, regardless of their political affiliation. But I do think there's little, things around the edges. We saw this with the Trump administration and their approach to the Affordable Care Act. They obviously were unsuccessful. The Republicans in Congress were unsuccessful at repealing the law. But the Trump administration did work within their administrative and regulatory power to kind of nibble around the edges and relax some of the more, if you want to think about them being like Democratic leaning priorities or things like that. And so I do think there are options on the table available to a Republican administration to maybe, pull off the gas a little bit, maybe not pump the brakes, but maybe just pull their foot off the gas if they wanted to do that. I don't know if we've really seen, again, I think the Eli Lilly announcement with the insulin was multifactorial, and cannot be attributed entirely or perhaps even primarily to the Inflation Reduction Act. It looks like that was more about avoiding Medicaid rebates that would have started in 2024. So, then really the Inflation Reduction Act or anything that was in the State of the Union. I do think it's interesting, one thing that will be interesting to see is, the inflation penalty rebates. inflation in 2022 was so high. I'm not sure, especially for the Part D drugs, where you just sort of have a single inflation benchmark. It's going to be tied to October of 2022. That inflation rate was so high and is actually well within sort of the historical norms for average price increases that, drug manufacturers have taken. I'm going to be interested to see just how much revenue they generate off of these inflation penalty rebates the first year for Part D, maybe the first few quarters for Part B, as in boy. I do think it will be interesting to see how those rebates play into pricing decisions. I don't know if they're going to be as impactful as policymakers or patients are maybe thinking they're going to be. We already have inflation penalty rebates in Medicaid, and I think we can all agree they haven't really done anything at all. Because I think the manufacturers just sort of assume that those are our cost of doing business. And then, for a drug, that doesn't have a huge market exposure to Medicare, having to pay an inflation penalty rebate on a relatively small percentage of your units sold. If you are primarily exposed to the commercial market, that's just not going to be a huge factor of consideration. As I was saying before, I will be interested to see how the negotiated prices, once we have those next year, how and if they resonate with the public. And do people start looking, especially folks in high deductible and plans where they have to pay coinsurance, do they start comparing prices from Medicare and the commercial market? And if the prices that they're seeing on their pharmacy receipt or invoice are significantly higher than the publicly available prices for Medicare, is that something, are we going to start having a sort of a conversation about that? Is that something that's going to permeate and get people talking? Are we going to be talking about that sort of as a society? We're going to see news articles written about patients that are confused or something. And so but that is, a year or more down the road. And so, yeah, I don't know, I know that President Biden wants to ring the victory bell on the Eli Lilly insulin price reduction, but I'm not sure how much more. Maybe you will see, we have Eli Lilly and, United Airlines with respect to their seating fees. Those are two big things where they have been voluntary on behalf of corporations. And so maybe you could see a pattern where government threatens regulation, and just the threat of regulation is enough to rein in some of the actions on the corporate. They become a little bit more self-governing. And so maybe we will see, once, like I said, with the negotiated prices, once they get out, does that sort of become a benchmark price that people talk about? And we'll see if that happens. But I think it's still a little too early to tell if the IRA has had a substantial impact on prescription drug spending.